National Corvette and Cave Museum. I'm just kidding. When a massive sinkhole opened up here on February 12th, swallowing 8 Corvettes, WKU faculty and students put their education, training, and expertise to work. Dr. Polk and Dr. Leslie North were among the first WKU Geoscience faculty members on the scene that morning, and they have been at the museum almost daily and continue to assess the sinkhole from a Karst Science point of view and make plans for outreach efforts related to sinkholes. Both are assistant professors of geosciences in the Department of Geography and Geology at Western Kentucky University. That department is known for cave, karst, environmental, and water research. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason Polk and Dr. Leslie North.
Well, first, thank you all for coming. I know that you're all very interested to learn all about this sinkhole and cave now that is, as Katie said, the National Corvette and Cave Museum. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to split up the presentation between both of us. And I'm going to start with asking how many of you know what a Corvette is? Right? We all know what a Corvette is. But if I were to ask you what is karst, how many of you prior to this event happening have ever heard the term karst? So there's what, like maybe 8, 10 people? The fact is you're actually in the majority if you don't know what karst is. As part of my research that I do in the university is I actually study what people know about karst and why not and how we can change that. And one of the first studies that I did, I actually asked 1,000 people if they knew what karst was, and 89% of them had never heard the term. And this was people who actually live in karst areas. So, what is karst? Karst is a landscape, and it's a landscape that forms on soluble bedrock, and we'll get to that in a second. But one of the things that people know karst by is you probably know karst features, even though you don't realize you know karst landscapes. So karst are things like caves, sinkholes, springs, aquifers, sinking streams, where you might see a stream on your property that's going across the landscape and then it just disappears underground. Those are sinking streams. In many instances, you also have underground rivers. So imagine the rivers that we see on the land surface, and they're the same thing, just happening to flow underground. We have these here in Kentucky. So as I said, these landscapes form from the dissolution of soluble bedrock. So for those of you who have no idea what I just said, basically what that means is we have bedrock which can be dissolved, and it can be dissolved by slightly acidic water. And so what happens is rain comes down from the landscape, or from the atmosphere. It can flow across the landscape and it picks up CO2, or carbon dioxide, along the process. And what that carbon dioxide does is it mixes with the water and you form carbonic acid. Now that carbonic acid, once it hits a landscape, such as one made of limestone or dolomite or gypsum or any other kind of soluble rock, it can be slowly eroded away. And that's what gives you the caves, the springs, the sinking streams, like which is shown here. Now, the question that people always say is, these things must be really rare because I've never heard of karst. And in reality, they're actually all over the place. So every image, or every place on this map shown in purple, is actually a karst landscape, or what the scientists consider karst landscapes. So you can see, even here in the United States, we have quite a few karst areas. If we were to zoom in and look more specifically at just the United States, this is showing you the karst. So anything that's red and pink, we consider karst. I.e., this is not a rare landscape, it's just one you don't know anything about. So, the question becomes, why are these important? Why have I dedicated my entire career, and Dr. Polk has also dedicated his career to studying these landscapes? And the reason for that is because they cover about 15% of the ice-free land surface, i.e. they're not rare. Most importantly, is that they're home to about 25% of the world's population. How many of you live in Kentucky? What about parts of Tennessee? Florida? Georgia, Florida. Hey, I'm a Floridian. Georgia, Alabama, several of you. Odds are, depending on where you live in those states, you probably also live on a karst landscape and just don't know it. Okay? If you live in Florida, I can guarantee you live on a karst landscape because 100% of that state is considered karst. Yeah, most of you didn't know that. See? Surprise! So, from a research point of view, we're really concerned about karst because they provide about 25% of the world's drinking water supplies. So that's a lot of water that we rely on from these very landscapes, yet no one in here, with the exception of maybe 8 or 10 of you, knew about them. And then lastly, if we look just at the US, about 40% of our groundwater comes from karst landscapes. Okay? So that's why we study them. That's why my interest is in how do we educate people about these areas so they know what they're doing and they know where their water's coming from. If we focus in more specifically on Kentucky, because we're all here to learn about this karst and this sinkhole that we have here, this is showing you the area, the dark blue and the light blue areas are showing you areas of the state which are considered karst. So again, it's not that rare, even though when 8 Corvettes were swallowed by a sinkhole, everyone all of a sudden knew everything about karst, and there was widespread panic because these landscapes were so rare. They really weren't rare for the scientists, and that's why we were here and like, well, it's a sinkhole for us. So, when you look at the land surface, what you have obviously is we're here to learn about sinkholes. And when you look at the land surface, this is probably what you would see. This is actually from south central Kentucky, this image. And so you see these rolling hills, and most people see them as rolling hills, but really what you're looking at is one side of a sinkhole you're going in, and the other side you're coming out of a sinkhole. They're everywhere. Underneath the landscape, what you might find are those karst features that I talked about, like caves, the sinkhole depressions. You might have caves that are filled with water. Maybe this is a river that would be flowing under there. You might have a river flowing on the surface that is draining into the ground. Okay, so this is a classic image of our region. And with that, since we're all here really to learn about the Corvette, I'm going to hand it over to Jason Polk, and I'll be back in a little bit. But he's going to talk to you some more about what are sinkholes, how do they form, what do we know about them, and really what do we know about this particular sinkhole that's here. So, Dr. Polk.
Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm going to sort of wander around and just have it. Teaching too much, making sure people are paying attention. And I think you all are paying attention. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the sinkhole. First, sinkholes in general, then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this particular sinkhole because we've obviously done a lot of work over the last few months. A lot of people have worked on it, a great team, and a lot of interest in what's happened here. And luckily we've been able to collect a lot of information about this particular sinkhole collapse. We can hopefully provide some of that information for you. So when you look at the landscape, as Leslie mentioned, you see here in Kentucky and in lots of other places in the world sinkholes. And you see these sinkhole landscapes that look kind of like an egg carton, where there's all these little depressions, and some have water, and it almost looks like there's hills in this rolling topography. And a lot of it is actually not so much hills like you'd find in other areas of the US or the world. They're just where these sinkholes have formed, and they're very old and kind of smooth-sided, and they're different types of sinkholes than what we have here in the museum. And so here's a sort of zoomed in picture of one not too far from here, and this one actually has water in it some. And you can see it's just kind of this gradual depression in the landscape, and you've probably seen this as you drive down 65, or if you just look out that window and look across the street, you'll see something like this. And the one we're more worried about, the one that's caused more concern, of course, is one like we have here at the Corvette Museum, and that is one that's more of a collapse, steep-sided, kind of dramatic feature in the landscape. So the question is, how do these things form? What is it that makes this feature unique in a karst landscape? And there's some diagrams and a bunch of different ways to explain that. And one thing is, looking at that very first type, the ones like we see when we drive around, that are very gradual, that don't look like the one that's here. They form where you have this rock that's dissolved away and a void gets formed. And as that void continues to grow, the sediment that's above it can get washed into it. So every time it rains, a little bit of that dirt, soil, clay, sand, depending upon where you're at, gets moved into that void below through cracks and crevices and areas that have dissolved out. And over time, you get a gradual depression as all that material gets removed from the surface and moved down into the subsurface into that void. And typically this can take hundreds to thousands of years to happen. So it's not a very dramatic occurrence. It doesn't happen instantaneously. And this is what you see most commonly around here. A second type of sinkhole, and a slightly different one, is what we call more of a collapse or cover collapse type of sinkhole, where it starts out that same process, but if you have clays and things like we have here in Kentucky, where the soils and sediments are a little bit more sticky, a little bit more cohesive, able to hold together, then as that sediment gets washed in from the surface, it actually only erodes from the bottom and the top stays intact. So as that happens over time, and again, this can take decades, centuries, you eventually have this arch that forms, or this really thin layer of soil that by itself is strong enough to stay together, but if you start to add weight, if you start to add water that makes it heavier, or people, or a building, or anything else that could potentially add extra burden to it, it can collapse, and it can happen catastrophically. It can happen immediately in just seconds. And this is not as common as what you see around here for sinkhole formation, but these do happen fairly often all throughout the southeastern U.S. and other parts of the world. And certainly when it does happen, it's pretty catastrophic and fairly immediate. And these things can be a foot in diameter, they can be 100 feet in diameter. It all just depends on where it's at, the type of soil, and how big the void is underneath. So remember those two types, because it almost seems like sinkholes are pretty simple. We got one, we got the other, pretty easy. But then there's a few others you could add to that. So I won't talk in detail about each one of these, but you have several different other types of sinkholes that can form from different kinds of geology. You can have different types of collapse that happen not just from soil collapsing, but also from the rock or the roof of the cave that collapses down into the hole or the void that's below. And so you see here that there can be more complexity to sinkhole formation. There can definitely be different types than just those first two, although the first two are the more common that you see, at least in this area. And so we'll get more into this as we talk about our particular sinkhole here at the Corvette Museum. And just to talk about the sort of ubiquity of sinkholes all over the area, if you look at this map, here's the Corvette Museum. You guys are sitting like right about here. And every one of these red circles with the lines in it is a sinkhole. So don't be scared. I can assure you that right now we're not directly on a sinkhole according to the map. We're just near a couple. And I know that there's definitely one just a few hundred feet that way. But they got a nice fence around it, you'll be okay. This is what a typical karst landscape looks like. If you pull up a map of Florida, it looks the same way. Pull up a map of Tennessee, in certain areas you can see the same thing. So this is available on the Kentucky Geological Survey website. I went in there, hit a couple buttons, and pulled this right up. So it's not something that's hard to find. It's fairly common knowledge if you know where to look. And what you see is that some are really big, some are smaller, lots of different sizes and shapes. And what you also see if you look at this with the aerial photo is that these are subdivisions and roads. This is I-65. So we built on top of this landscape, and we always have built on top of this landscape for decades, if not hundreds of years. And we've learned how to build on sinkholes, around sinkholes. We've learned how to deal with them as they happen. We've learned how to deal with them before they happen when we build, so that we understand some of the risks and consequences. And that's why when we see sinkholes, at least for those of us who study them, we don't really panic or worry as much because, again, they're fairly common. We see them everywhere, and we deal with them all the time. Engineering, construction, they deal with these all the time. And so it's very hard to predict when a sinkhole like the one here would happen. But at the same time, being aware of the risk helps you figure that out ahead of time and make sure you know what you're doing. And it can't be perfect because, as you can see, you can throw a dart and have a hard time not hitting a sinkhole area. And if you blow it out a little bit further on the map here and zoom out just a bit, you actually see here Mammoth Cave National Park, just a little bit to the north of us, and all of these red dots are sinkholes. So again, we have them everywhere, and we actually can start to get an idea where they might form. Some of the things we do ahead of time on landscapes when we try to look at sinkholes are, you can see areas where they form in almost lines. You can start to see groupings and clusterings of sinkholes. And that's typically associated with cave systems that are beneath those sinkholes and voids. So we kind of know a little bit about where they might occur, at least on sort of a big picture, when you zoom out and look at a landscape. Now, if I zoom in and just want to look at your house, it's a lot harder. But if I zoom out, I get a much better idea. So case by case, we can get a good sense of what may happen in sinkhole development. So what about this one? What about this National Corvette Museum sinkhole? I know it's a heartbreaking photo. You look at it, it just makes you want to cry. I think I saw some grown men crying that day. You know, it was sad, and I understood it because these are rare vehicles. It only gets worse the farther you look into the hole. Luckily, it does not look like this anymore, thanks to a great effort by a bunch of folks. And so, when this first happened, we wanted to get a first look. From a research perspective, and for trying to understand what happened, we said, well, what can we do? Luckily, WKU's engineering department had a unique device, which was a quadcopter. You can kind of see part of it here. So some students developed this thing where it has a camera mounted, and they're able to fly it. It has goggles that control the camera. Wherever they look, and that camera follows. So it's really interesting when you don't have to go into the sinkhole, because that's scary. But you can fly in a device that can go and find out what's going on and take a look and give you a first sense of anything else that may be happening. We didn't really know what was going on when it first collapsed underneath. Was there further risk? Was there water? Was there some other thing we didn't know about? And so this really helped. It was a great effort by the students to be able to go out and test this first run for their quadcopter to go and see what was down there and help us get a sense of it so that we know how to take the next step. And so once we got a look and started to figure out what was going on, a general idea of this sinkhole and its shape and size, and a little bit more about what was down there, a huge team of folks. Started, of course, by Scott Murphy-Daniel, coordinating the effort of construction, and then a bunch of other people from DDS Engineering, Hayward Baker Geotech, folks from InSafe, WKU, obviously the Corvette Museum, the City of Bowling Green, some partners at YSI, which helps with data instruments and logging instruments. Everybody came together really well to start to figure out, okay, how do we get the Corvettes out? How do we understand what the hole looks like and where its size and shape start and stop, and then what to do to fix it. And so this was sad. This is the sad thing. When Karst meet Karst, it's not a good thing. And so the first step, of course, was to go down and try to figure out how to get the cars out. But we started a little bit broader. Before that happened, we actually started immediately to look at some of the surrounding landscape, because that was the first concern. Is there a risk of other sinkhole development? Are there things here that could still happen that we need to worry about? And so we know that there was this subsidence and sinkhole feature that had been sort of developed into a pond, a retention pond, or drainage basin pond that was next to it. So we said we can monitor that. We can start to look at that and see if we have water movement, if there's a big plume of sediment that would come from a collapse inside or somewhere else that we're not sure of. And so we started to go out, and I took some students and we collected some data. And we basically tried to look at the depth of the pond. We started to install some equipment to monitor the level of the pond and some of the chemistry of it. And so we got some sponsorship and partners from YSI and EXO from Fondrest Environmental, and they sent us this really fancy logger that we could install with help from the City of Bowling Green, so that we could then go and look at levels of the water, start to do some monitoring of rainfall, and really the next worry was, well, what if it rains again? Do we have to worry about the sinkhole and further changes? Or what about other development as we do construction on this site, this project? Is there going to be a risk for further collapse or something else that could change we don't know about? So we started to do that, and then once that was set up, the next step here was simultaneously to start shoring up the Skydome and the spire, putting in some micropiles, which are basically big steel beams, the soil and the rock all the way down to some stable rock to support these structures that can be tied into, so that we know that at least the structures now that still stand safely, the spire and the Skydome, aren't going to change. They're not going to move. They're not going to collapse. And then, of course, while this happened, there were Corvettes being pulled out. So very successfully, Scott Murphy-Daniel did an amazing job pulling out Corvettes one after another, faster than I think any of us really thought possible. And luckily, some still in fairly good shape, some not in so good shape, but still successfully extracted all 8 Corvettes, which is pretty amazing. Pretty amazing considering the conditions and what they were working with and all the unknowns. So I think it was a great team effort. Lots of interesting ways to go about this. You'll have to talk to them more. I'm going to focus on the sinkholes, but I think it was pretty creative, some of the ways that between the engineers, the architects, the construction folks, they were able to come up with ways to extract these corvettes, do it safely, do it without any further collapse or damage to the corvettes or to the sinkhole. And so we started digging into science after that. Once the corvettes were out of the way, once we got the pesky corvettes out of the hole, then we could start doing some karst science. So we started looking at things like the soils, and taking a first look and wondering, okay, is it that second type of sinkhole that I showed? The one where you have that arch of soil that collapses. And the clays here certainly are fairly sticky. They don't really bend or move or break too easily. They're pretty strong, they can hold together. And so we started to look at some of that, kind of follow that pathway. We started to look down at the hole itself. So in some of the areas where we drilled into areas around the sinkhole, we lowered down cameras. And we tried to look and see if there were more openings, a bigger void, how deep. And through this, we also looked at where the drilling would hit a gap. Because when you drill down, you can see whether you're in rock or you're in air. And so collectively, we started to compile some information and really start to figure out what was going on just outside of the main sinkhole and see if there was more potential for risk and what type of remediation would be possible. So part of it was also looking at the local geology. And so here we have actually two different types of limestone that are really common in this area, the St. Genevieve and St. Louis. The Corvette Museum is right here, almost at a contact between the two. And so that started to give a clue. When you're in a contact between two types of rock, it's basically like trying to put two bricks on top of each other, and you've got a mortar joint in between. And well, here those two lay on top of each other, and sometimes where they touch or where they contact, you can have an area where caves can form, or you can have some sort of void space. So from there, we wanted to get a closer look. We kind of got a good look of everything else outside of the immediate collapse, what was going on in the geology and the water and some of the sediments. So the next thing was, what's going on in the hole? We want to get in the hole and see what happens when we get down there outside of what we can see from the surface. And so we went and did some rigging, some really nice integration between caving techniques and safe construction techniques to come up with ways to get down in here, both as part of the Corvette extraction and as part of our exploration and survey of the sinkhole. And so we were able to get up top and actually go down and look at what was going on in the hole. And we worked with different people on this. We have here one of the folks from the construction crew getting trained. So we worked with Bowling Green Fire Department to go out and use their facilities to train these guys on how to maneuver and work inside the sinkhole and actually be able to be safe at the same time. This is a video from up top. So a view not many people have actually had a chance to see. So I went up in a boom lift to rig up those ropes that you saw. And when I was up there, I had time to take a little video just to see what it looked like from a bird's eye. So I will show you, hopefully if it works, what it looks like from up top. It's a little scarier from this perspective. Luckily I didn't have to climb up there. So it's impressive. You know, it's kind of intimidating looking at it from up top. We started to get a sense of just what we were dealing with and just how big and how deep this thing could be. So then the question became, we know that there's more down there. We could see from some of the edges that this hole was obviously bigger than just what it looked like from the top, but we just didn't know yet. We started to get some information, but we just didn't have all the data yet. So I'm going to take you through some pictures and kind of give you an idea of what it looks like in there. And prior to this, there was some geophysical work done by NSAFE, really well done job by them to do what's called microgravity. And that is basically a way to look at gravity anomalies of the subsurface. So it's a very technical piece of equipment that can more or less detect voids. And so that was used first. And from that, we noticed that there were some larger areas of void space than just the collapse that we could see inside the Skydome. So we knew there could be more void space, maybe cave down there, and we started to go with that approach. And so the first thing we did was go into the cave and go down one side of the sinkhole area and then the other side. So we did some exploration first, then we went back in and did some mapping. And so the exploration was to see if there really was anything there. So this is some of what we saw. And the first thing you notice is lots and lots of bedrock. So this is that limestone. You can see it's all cracked and weathered and broken. And that's fairly common. It's a fairly common thing around here because it's very old. The limestones around here are around 350 million years old. So they're not young. We're talking millions and millions of years old. And then once you get down in there, once you leave that immediate collapse area that you see when you walk out there, this is what you see. So this is on the south side. So this would be looking sort of out towards that pond, kind of that direction. And these are two of my colleagues here. This is Brian Ham from NSAFE, and this is my graduate student, Keegan McClanahan, going in there to help do some exploration survey. Also, I had another graduate student, Dan Nedvedek, who helped with the first initial exploration. And what we started to do was just document and get a sense of what was going on. So what you first see is a lot of layers of rock. This limestone actually forms in layers, and that's pretty common. And then you see here some of the sediment from the collapse, some of the breakdown and debris, some big rocks that broke off the walls and ceiling. And then you start to see some of what we see from down below, which is that it's big. It's a big hole. So this would be looking up towards the surface, and this is again for scale, these two guys, and just a piece of what we see in there. So when we got in, the first thing was that this is a lot bigger than we thought it was going to be. It's a lot deeper than we thought it was going to be. This is looking from sort of the back end of the cave passage on the south towards the entrance, which is up in this area here. And what you see here is something that is not typically found in caves or sinkholes, and that are these micropiles. So these are actually what was put in by Hayward Baker to shore up the Skydome. So it's one of the first times where you actually can go into a void, at least for me, and see some of the remediation already at work. So we tested it out, we came back out, told them it was good, it was safe, we trusted it, good job. Let them know that it was where they thought it was, they hadn't lost anything. And so you can see it, they just drill through the rock, hit the void, drill right through that, go into deeper rock, and that provides the support. So it gives you a lot of security and safety because we know that this is going to be stable because it's down 100, 150 feet into solid rock. And you can see here again, some of that micropile work, you see some of this, which is actually some grout, sort of like concrete that's used to help fill in some of that void and stabilize this as it goes through the hole, and you can see another one over here. So we were able to see about 6 or 7 of these things in different parts of this cave as we explored and mapped it. Here's just another view, same thing. And you get a sense that it's a pretty good sized hole. So there's my grad student for scale, and so a little bit bigger than we thought it would be. And we also saw some interesting features that sort of geeked out the geologist in us, which is looking at some of these other features in the rock to help us understand where the water comes in and how it dissolved over time. So we actually see here a little hole that comes in from the surface where water was flowing through, more or less dripping. So this whole part of the cave was almost like rain. Water was just dripping everywhere. And that was pretty common for caves, but also something we just didn't know until we got in there to tell. So here's a view looking up, and you start to get a sense of just how big it is. You also see in this picture some of this freshly broken rock. So that gave us some clues about some other pieces to it that we weren't sure of. When you see the freshly broken rock, we then started to know that there was more than just soil at work here. And we started to look at more faces of rock. And here you can see that we see some different impurities in the rock. Gave us an idea that this is pretty weathered rock. So it's pretty eroded, pretty old. It's definitely been undergoing some breakdown and some processes of dissolution and erosion and all the fun things we use to describe rock disappearing and breaking in the science side of things. So that was the south side. We came back up, gave the thumbs up, we're still alive, went down the north side of the hole, and this would be the side like you're heading down towards the parking lot, kind of that direction. And you see here again, more of that broken rock. You see what we call a cantilever, or something that almost looks like a cantilevered barn, a cantilevered roof, where it steps down as you go further back into the cave. And as you go further back into it, you see again that it opens up into a fairly big cave. Now this side was dry. This side was fairly dry. We didn't see any water really anywhere. We saw some sediments, but it was all very dry. Hadn't had any water in a long time. See again another one of those micropiles that was nice because we felt safe, or at least we felt like the Skydome was safe above us. I wasn't so sure when we were here how safe we were because again, the ceiling, you can see where rock is freshly broken off at some point. And freshly could be 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. It could be on the geologic time scale or it could be on the human time scale in this part where we're sort of further back away from the main collapse that we can see on the surface. And so when you look at the pictures, you start to see, again, old rock. So this rock had broken off the ceiling or walls a long time ago, and it had sediment. Again, it was dry, it had been there probably for quite some time. And you can see here another up-close picture of that micropile as it comes down through the cave itself, further down deeper into the solid rock below. You also see some different mineral broken off. We're doing some work on those to figure out what that may have to do with this. And here's a picture just looking back up, kind of a rare view from the sinkhole. Looking up, you see some of the pieces of rock here that's hanging down. This is about the size of a bathtub, just hanging by a thread. We didn't get near that. And you can see bigger pieces. So all these bigger pieces of rock that had broken off when this collapse happened, or maybe just before it happened sometime in the last few decades or centuries. And then you see here again some of the mapping and some more of that interesting geology in the rock itself, where a lot of this is freshly broken as you move towards the top of the collapse. What used to probably be the ceiling of this cave passage as it went underneath the Skydome. And then here's again sort of a first look at what we saw when we got down there when it wasn't lit up and nice for photos. And you can see again all that sediment that's dried out. You can see here old rock. It's been there a long time. This thing's not a new feature. This cave itself, this void, it's been there for a long time. And you can see again here more of that freshly broken rock, some of the impurities and things. So it started to give us clues about what might have caused the sinkhole. Some more information that we didn't have just from looking at it from the surface. So I give you an up-close and personal view here. So pictures are great, but videos give you a much better experience. So I'm going to try to get this thing to work. So this is more what it looks like when you're in there. The photos don't do it justice because they're all lit up and nice. This is more what it looks like if you were in there with just a light by yourself. Wouldn't be so bad if I wasn't scared of the dark. So it gives you just a sense of how big it is, what it looks like, and kind of the natural feel of it. And so we had done the geophysics, some of the drilling, and then again, we wanted to tie this together. So now that we knew there was something down there, we wanted to go back through and try to map it. And so we do this in lots of places. Mammoth Cave, we know how long it is. We know that it's 400 miles long because it's been mapped. Teams of people, experts have gone in there and done a cave survey to map this feature out so that we can tie in that underground area to the surface area and try to figure out what size and shape it is. So you see us go in there, and the instrumentation is pretty basic. We use compasses. We use something called a clinometer that can give you angles up and down, or vertical angles. And then we use laser distometers, which are basically like tape measures, but with lasers that you can shoot. And we go in and we basically measure from station to station all the different points to the wall, to the ceiling, to the floor. And we do it at a very high accuracy. We do what's called a grade 5 survey, and we go in and it's basically within plus or minus 2 degrees, plus or minus a foot or two of accuracy so that we can go through and make sure that everything we map matches. In this case, it worked out really, really well. We had a great team. We mapped it, and when we came out, we were fortunate to have some of the survey work from DDS that we could tie in, and we knew where some of these micropiles were. So when I measured it in the cave and sketched in where one of these things was, I could go out and overlay that on top of where we knew it was on the surface. And luckily, for me, it matched. Everything matched up where it's supposed to be. So we felt really good about capturing the dimensions of this void and knowing that it represented what we could see down below from the surface that was hard to do before. So spent about a whole day going in and doing this, doing the survey, using the instruments, doing everything with corrections, and trying to make sure we tied it all together. In the end, we get this kind of rough-looking sketch where we do a couple different things. The first thing we do is the bird's eye. So we do a plan or a bird's eye view. We do a profile view, which is like you would do a cross-section in it. So if you slice the cave in half, you can look at it from the side. And then we do actual cross-section. So if you're standing in a hole and you're looking down the next direction of wherever you would go to walk, we do a slice that way too. So 3 kind of different views of what the cave would look like. And so this is what it looks like if you pop it up and look at the map. So This dotted line here is the collapse that you walk up to when you go out the Skydome, and the area here in this darker line is actual mapped void that you can't see. So this is the profile view, so if you were looking at it from the side, you would see again. Here's the floor that you would stand on, and this is how it goes down. And you can sort of see how deep it goes. And the scale over here, a little hard to see on this to fit it all in because it's a big map. It's about 80 feet or so to here. So we know we're about 80 feet, a couple places more like 90, 95 feet below the floor before you would actually get to some solid ground at the bottom of the collapse. And then these are all the little cross sections of what each one of these would look like if you took a slice out of it. So if you kind of zoom in a little bit, you can see here in the yellow an outline of sort of the footprint of the Skydome, at least the inside part, and then you would actually see here the spire in this red, and you can see the collapse again right there. And so we know now from the survey how much more there is, how much bigger it is than just what we can see right there at the edge of the collapse. And so this helps a lot because it gives an idea of volume, gives you an idea of dimensions, tells us how big it is, how deep it is, and basically gives all the information necessary to move forward. So how do we fix this, remediate it? What's the next step here so that you can repair this and get back to having Corvettes in there instead of construction workers? So we got to collect some more data. We're not quite done yet. We have to learn a little bit more. We have to analyze some of these samples. So we were able to collect some things. We want to go back and do a little bit more analysis and figure out what happens. The plan for remediation is in the works. So it's something with the Corvette Museum and the construction folks and engineering folks to figure out what do we do? What's the best way to fix this, to make it stable, to make it secure? And there's a lot of different ideas floating around now, I think, about that, and some really interesting possibilities to make it safe and yet also be an educational resource. I think it'll be really exciting to see what happens in the future. And then the biggest part of this is Karst education. What do we do from here to help people learn about these types of features and what happens? How do you learn about sinkholes? How do you understand why this happened? Well, for this one, it's really interesting because we showed you a couple different types of sinkholes and how they form. A really rare type that doesn't happen very often is when the roof of a cave collapses. Now, about 12 years ago, this happened at Dishman Lane. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but if you go south a few miles here down towards Lost River Cave, there was a road that was built called Dishman Lane, and it collapsed in. And it was a pretty big sinkhole, almost 190-some feet wide, about 25 feet deep. So fairly substantial, bigger than this one in some ways. But that was part of a cave that was mapped and known about when the roof collapsed. And this is, again, a very rare type. There may only be a handful anywhere in this region of those that have been documented. And others may happen, but we just don't have them documented or mapped or known about. Here, it seems like we may have another one that's really been well documented and scientifically studied. And so it's kind of an interesting thing because you don't get that opportunity very often. So it looks less like it was one of those soil collapses or one of those normal kind of common types of sinkholes we showed. And instead looks more like it was from other things. We had some heavy rains the week before. It could have caused the soil to become very wet and heavy. We had some freezing that occurred the first day or two before the collapse. And that could have had something to do with implications, again, on where that water moved in the soil and the heaviness of it and some of the different aspects that control these things. And it may have just been that last final piece of clay or that last grain that moved the right way that then was bridging that rock and that cave and it just collapsed. So it would have probably been very hard to predict this and know that it was going to happen. It's one of those things that's a rarity. It's one of those things that doesn't happen that often. If it would have happened 100 feet in almost any direction, we wouldn't have really paid much attention to it because it wouldn't have been in the Skydome and it wouldn't have swallowed 8 Corvettes. We get these types of things all over the place in Kentucky. I've looked at, I don't know, 24 of them probably since January. And some of them are tiny, some of them are in fields, some of them are on the side of the road. People don't usually do a whole lot other than point them out, maybe go out and fix them. So it's not something that really becomes a problem unless it swallows Corvettes or people. I did a BBC documentary last summer down in Florida about the gentleman that got swallowed when he was in his house. And, that was a huge one. It was definitely in the news and definitely made people worried. But again, I think from what I've read, that was the only documented death from a sinkhole in Florida in decades and decades and decades, in the history of keeping track of it. So it's not something that causes a lot of risk and worry to most people. As you become educated and learn more about how they form and what happens in karst landscapes, it it typically is something that makes people feel more comfortable instead of more worried because they have understanding. You know, it's not a mystery anymore. For this one, scientifically, it's really interesting. It helps us add knowledge, which is going to help us to educate and provide information to the public. And I think from that aspect, it's been really exciting and really, really fortunate for us as scientists to be able to have this opportunity to work with the museum. And luckily, we already had some of this underway, so I'm going to turn it over to Leslie and let her tell you about some of the things that were going on. We were actually involved in some of this karst education before this happened, and this has really been a way to bolster it for us. So I'll turn it over to her. She'll tell you about that now. And we'll wrap it up.
So as Jason was saying, when the sinkhole happened, it was like kind of ironic for us because we were actually headed to a meeting with the city of Bowling Green hydrology department. And we were meeting with them to talk about karst and sinkholes and caves and groundwater in the region because we have a collaboration with them. So that's why when we were said that we were one of the first ones on the scene, it just so happened that we were already in a meeting and all of us were already together. So the thing that we want you to leave here with is one, not fear. Don't be afraid to live in a karst area, as many of you kind of freaked out a little bit when I said Florida was 100% karst. As I said, I'm from Florida. I never had any problems with sinkholes. I live now in Kentucky. We've been here on a regular basis and we walk around confident that we're safe here. But it is an unknown and it's a risk living in a karst area. But what you need to think about is that anywhere you live you have a risk, right? In Kansas or Oklahoma there's a risk of tornadoes. If you live in Florida you have a risk of hurricanes. If you live along a riverbank you might have a risk of flash flooding. So there's everything. Everywhere we are there's some kind of risk and it's really about managing your risk and learning about those areas. If you live in Kansas or Oklahoma or parts of Nebraska, you know how to protect yourself against a tornado, right? You know if you live in a hurricane area, what you should do to protect yourself and your home and your friends and your family and everyone else from being injured by that hurricane. It's the same thing with caves and karst and sinkholes. There are things that we can do and education is the biggest one. So what we're going to do is show you just a few things that you can look at. This is a free PDF document that's available online. If you type in Living with Karst, I guarantee it will be the very first link that pops up. There were very many notable karst scientists who were involved with this project from all over the country. So please take a look at that, and what it does is it explains some of the concepts that we were really only able to very briefly touch on today, like karst and caves and how these things form. For those of you who actually live in our region or in Florida, we actually have a partnership also with the Southwest Florida Water Management District in Florida. So it has a sister site. So this is under bgky.org, and what this site is a repository of information for you guys. So you can go here, you can click the Learn More button, and what you can see when you get there are graphics that you can download. You can take these, distribute them, learn from them. There are also places on the website which have more detailed descriptions, again, of the things that we were really only able to kind of touch on here. Here's another example. This one is actually from Under Florida, or Under Your Feet. And again, this is the sister site for the BG, the bowlinggreenky.org website. So again, it's just telling you about what are these landscapes, what do we need to know about them, why are they important, how do we live with them safely. And with that, we will say thank you. We were asked to leave plenty of time for questions, so we're happy to answer questions that you may have. So thank you.
All right. Are there any fault lines in Kentucky? There are lots of fault lines in Kentucky. Yeah, we're obviously near the New Madrid fault zone, so we definitely have evidence, as you can see in some caves, and obviously in the geologic mapping of fault lines. Around here, I haven't noticed any that are directly sort of pertinent or relevant, but there's definitely some nearby and quite a few around the state. It's a really good question, and probably better for Hayward Baker to answer. But you always have a risk for a void. And so I think the goal is you go down and try to find an area where you don't have voids. So we knew we would drill down and potentially find voids at 60, 70, 80, 100 feet. In this case, sometimes had to go deeper to find that good continuous solid rock. And most of the time you only get 8 or 10 feet of continuous rock. To be safe and secure, 30 or 40 feet is even better. And a lot of Bowling Green is built over 30 or 40 feet of rock with a cave underneath of it, and it's typically not a problem. So here it was really just case by case, micropile by micropile. They're not all at the same depth, they're all slightly different, and it really does depend on where you're at in that geology and what it looks like, because it's not very homogeneous, it's all kind of different. Other questions? So my hands up.
It's funny you mention that because that's actually in the talks. So right now, as Jason said, they're really trying to figure out what is the next step forward. And I study these things. I've been in show caves and sinkholes all over the world. And I've never seen an actual sinkhole museum quite like what we could make here. So the talk is that basically using this as an avenue to promote education about these resources. Because again, I mean, it's learning about them and knowing what signs are and knowing what you can do as an individual in your community to really live safely in these areas. That we shouldn't be, mass exiting Bowling Green or all of these karst areas because we're going to run out of land pretty quick. They're all over the place. So yes, it is in the discussions. We'll see.
My wife and I are lucky. We live up north where we don't have a but there's a big discussion on fracking now. I call it fracking. Put that possibly into this equation where we can start developing sinkholes.
It's a good question. I mean, anytime you start to modify the surface and subsurface, then you have potential for anything like this to happen. A lot of times when we see things we call sinkholes, it's not actually a natural process of sinkhole formation like you would see if you were to watch a karst area for 100 years. It's from a broken water main, a leaky sewer pipe, some other sort of artificial man-made introduction of water or something that causes that collapse. So something like fracking could definitely introduce water in areas that could disturb the subsurface. It may not be the exact same process because, again, if you don't have limestone and sort of those voids already, it'll be slightly different, but there's always risk. There's lots of areas that are not karst that you see sinkhole-like formations that come from that kind of activity. Sir. Inside a building. Yeah, there's a handful. I mean, we've seen them happen before. Inside houses and buildings. As a percentage?
Microscopic.
Yeah, low percentage. Yeah, fairly low percentage. If you go to Florida, you'll see a lot of them sort of in and around houses and that sort of thing. Which there's a lot that are not in or around houses, but they don't get reported or noticed or submitted to insurance companies because nobody cares. The farmer who has one in the field doesn't care about that. So overall, if you looked at all sinkholes, the percentage of those is pretty low. It's pretty low, especially inside of a building like this, to have a catastrophic collapse inside of the building. There's not as many cases of that by far compared to others. So.
And I would say, building on to that we found it kind of ironic when we were here that day that our office manager actually ended up starting to give out our cell phones because so many people were calling the department to report sinkholes, that there was a sinkhole and they just opened up and they knew that it had just opened up. Well, there's a sinkhole database. That's how we know where sinkholes are. We can map these things, as Jason showed. We know where many of them are. And it was kind of interesting to us that so many of these new reported sinkholes have actually been there for 5, 6, 7 years. Just nobody had ever paid attention to them until something like this happened. So, that's why we say it's a very, very, very small fraction, and that's why people don't know about caves and karst, because we don't pay attention to them unless there's 8 priceless Corvettes in the bottom of it. Then all of a sudden it got everybody's attention pretty quick.
Yeah, there's one on 65 as you go north, and this was all over the radio. There must have been 10 people that called in adamant. There was this huge sinkhole open up in the Swallow Highway that's been there for years and years and years. And it's not very big, but we got continuous calls about this emergency. It's not an emergency. That sinkhole's been there forever. It's been looked at, examined, studied. It's not a threat, but you know, you hear sinkhole on the radio and you're driving by, you look to the right, you see one. You know, it's like tremors. Everything's disappearing. It's getting sucked into the ground. The whole world's going to end. And you know, I truly appreciate that sort of perspective and sort of fear, but luckily it was not the case. It happened pretty instantly. I would say, you know, more seconds than minutes. If you'd have been there as a person, it would have been scary. It would have been something that, you know, you would have had a 50-50 chance, like anything, life and death, of trying to get out of there. So it looked like from the video, it took a little while for the whole collapse to happen. You know, it cut off before we got to see the whole thing. But it was pretty fast. It was definitely pretty fast. We saw lots of pieces of cars. We brought out pieces of cars that we didn't expect to find. You know, that license plate that you saw was actually at the very bottom, like back in the cave a little ways, sort of at the bottom of the slope. Way farther in than I expected. I didn't know. I thought it was a piece of rock. I picked it up and dusted it off, and I was like, wow, this is not that. So, yeah, when it happened, it was pretty catastrophic, because stuff was everywhere. Way farther in than we thought. I went up to a piece on the north side that I thought was an interesting cherty, a piece of limestone, and it was actually concrete. It wasn't what I expected. So there's probably still a lot down there that is just buried and will get dug out eventually, hopefully.
Did you say that area out there generally doesn't cause
we don't know that it's connected for sure, but it's really, really close. I would imagine it's part of the same system, and it's something that collapsed in way before we were here doing anything on the surface. So we're going to work on some of that with the mapping and some more of the data to try to see if we can figure out how far we are from that to the new one.
You know, I would say actually you could probably make a pretty good argument for it being able to be funded federally, particularly if you can tie these things into groundwater. And one of the things that we hinted at but we didn't really talk about is how sensitive these landscapes are to pollution, particularly groundwater pollution, yet they're providing 25% of the world with drinking water. So as water resources become more and more scarce and more to how can we protect our water resources, I think if you couched an argument in that, then it would be very feasible to create some type of exhibit that's really conveying that information to the public. There's just a lack of karst information out there, and that's why people don't know about it.
Question in the back.
I would imagine that you don't have too many videos of a sinkhole happening. How much was the video an education for you, or a learning process?
It was really helpful. I mean, it was really helpful both from being able to figure out where cars may have went in, from the folks trying to extract those on the construction side, and to us to kind of get an idea of how fast it happened and sort of what happened. Was it all at once? Was there a void there that the floor finally just gave way, or did it all happen at one time? Was it sort of the roof and the soil and the floor of the Corvette Museum all happening at the same time? So it was useful because there aren't that many videos out there of this type of thing happening. You don't really see this live. Mostly it's videos of people running in the other direction and just all over the place. So you don't see it too often, but in this case, yeah, it was fortunate. It was fortunate to have that. Even more fortunate that it was done by security cameras and not by somebody, and nobody got hurt.
Here's the lady's question. My question may have been answered by your answer to her. You said this may have been here a long time. What do you consider a long time in that case?
It's a good question. I don't have a definitive answer, but decades, centuries. The cave itself, we know, is probably thousands and thousands of years old for sure. As far as the actual collapse and that sinkhole portion of it, there's no telling. There's really no telling. It could be It's been there for 100,000 years. Finally just worked its way up to the surface and became weak enough that it collapsed in. Definitely I would say it's more on the geologic timescale. We know from work we've done that the rock itself doesn't dissolve that quickly. You can't form Mammoth Cave in a day or a year or a decade. Mammoth Cave formed over millions and millions of years, just like most of the caves around here. And so most of that void was already there. Before this happened, it was just that last few feet or tens of feet that would have been the roof, and the soil above it that would have eroded and dissolved over the last few decades or centuries. So it's tough to tell that. That's part of what we're still trying to work on. If we can collect the right data, we may be able to get a little better idea. In Kentucky, you do. In Kentucky, you do. You have, there's subsurface mineral rights. So in some places you don't, in some places you do. There's certain states and countries where you don't, and they own everything. All the caves and everything underground is protected federally or by state. In Kentucky, you do. You know, if you own a cave and it goes on someone else's property, then they own what's on their property, you own what's on yours. Question over here? It's always a good thing. I used to do insurance sales many years ago, and I would always say, hey, insurance is a good thing. You know, it's an expense that is sort of hard to rationalize because there's nothing wrong, but at the same time, having the insurance is really helpful. Luckily, here they had insurance, so it's a great thing because when it does happen, you know, the if is always the risk, and that's the part you can't predict. So it's just like car insurance. Hopefully, you never get in an accident, but if you ever do, it's a lot cheaper and safer and better to have it than not. So. Sinkhole insurance, you know, it's something that's debated a lot. You know, different states have different requirements. Some states don't offer it. Some states require it. Other states it's optional. And so I think it's something that, if you have the opportunity, just like flood insurance, it's better to be safe and protected than not, just because you don't know. And that's part of, again, being educated about the fact that you live on Karst and knowing that these are the risks that could happen and whether or not you want to take that risk. Organic is in like critters or plants? We didn't see anything in there that... We didn't see anything like that down there. Yeah, there was no remains of animals or Pleistocene fossils or anything that would have told us that some critters or Indians were walking around in there, you know, thousands or millions of years ago. And as far as from the microscopic scale, there could be interesting things down there, bacteria and other stuff, but we didn't get a chance to look into that.
For me, you know, there's going to be a lot more micropiles than I have before.
I'll say to be determined. I don't know. That's going to be up to the Corvette Museum and the construction geotechnical folks to figure out what's the best plan.
Well, what I'm saying is, but these other buildings, they get
There's been, I mean, remediations in the past and other places. That's a typical way. It's the micropiles and have a supported platform, or in other cases to fill in the hole and build it back up to where it's secure and then concrete over top of it. So sometimes it's a combination of both. It really just depends on the situation and how feasible it is.
I think we went over there and you can walk on it. See the sinkhole and there's just the cars where they were.
You know, it's been talked about, so you never know. Yeah.
Other questions? It's possible once the sinkhole occurs that it can continue to evolve, and it all depends on where you're at. Florida's different. Florida's a little more unique because the soil's a little different, the rock's a little different. you can definitely have the sinkhole continue to widen or deepen over days, depending upon what happened. You know, if there's some water associated with it, or other aspects that could continue to cause it to evolve, and that does happen sometimes. But in this case, we've done a lot of work drilling those things, so it's been stable since it happened. There's been no further collapses. So here, I don't think you have to worry about that as much, but in other cases, it does happen.
I think the take-home message as far as that is concerned is that no two karsts are the same, no two sinkholes are the same, and that's why we say that, well, it depends, because every place is a little bit different depending on your age of your rock, your type of your rock, your type of the soil. That can all influence how your sinkhole develops, where it might develop, how it, or in this instance, what influences might trigger the sinkhole to form. So it's really, that's why we say it's about learning about your particular region. And when we are remediating these things, you have to approach every one of them very differently. So in this particular instance, the Corvette Museum has been wonderful, and that they've allowed all of these people to come in, and this is probably one of the most well-studied sinkholes ever, just because there's such a huge team and everybody with their own little niche of expertise that are coming together to really figure out exactly what's going on here and what was the best steps forward. So.
There are usually some studies done, and not as much as in the past, but now that we've gotten better technology and we sort of understand things better, you know, there's ways to go out and do drillings, you know, and look at drill cores and figure out what's down there. There's definitely geophysical work, so we use things like electrical resistivity and microgravity. In Florida, they use ground penetrating radar, and again, based on soil and sort of rock types, you can use different techniques. And it's not done everywhere in every construction site, but it's done a lot more now than it used to be. So a lot of the places around here that are being built currently, there's been remediation done ahead of time, you know, or mitigation really just to prevent collapses, so that you go out and sort of look at that landscape before you build the building and make sure that if there are sinkholes or voids or issues, that you take care of it ahead of time prior to construction. And that may be building the building on micropiles before you even finish it. And so it's much more known about, you know, construction engineering. Companies now are much more aware, I think, than they were decades ago about this type of construction engineering risks. So it seems like now people do a lot more due diligence ahead of time. And a lot of that's just driven by the technology and the knowledge. Those are existing sinkholes, and when that happens around here at construction, there's a lot of times that sinkholes are discovered, and usually that's all done just through regular remediation. So they'll fill them up or concrete or grout those and make sure that everything's stable ahead of time. So there's different techniques based on how big the sinkhole is, sort of where it's at, and all those were existing sinkholes. So it's typical that you find those sinkholes before construction. They're not usually caused by the construction as often on that type of project, but it does happen sometimes during construction. If you change the water table or you do any other kind of landscape or other alterations, sometimes you do cause sinkholes during construction, but typically it's early enough on that you can fix it before it's a problem. Anybody else? Well, we'd like to thank everybody, and especially thank the Corvette Museum for the opportunity. We encourage you guys to learn more, and obviously if you see anybody walking around from Scott Murphy Daniel or DDS or NSAFE or Hayward Baker, those guys deserve a pat on the back. They've done a fantastic job out here with site access and security and safety and extracting Corvettes. So hey for the Corvettes. Thank you.
Thank you.